originated as a societal pattern and, perhaps for a time, can be seen as normally out of control, temporarily in parts of Europe as a result of the Crusades and Inquisitions. The American natives at the time did not understand this reaction well. It is taught in elementary schools that the indigenous people of the Northeast often helped the settlers who had to work long hours on their small starting farms. The Indians would bring some food or perhaps ask for some. Often they would end up watching the settlers' young children while the settlers farmed. Through these means, over time, the indigenous might ultimately be exploiting the children with post-hypnotic direction, providing perfectly matched conditions for the post-hypnotic instructions given to the newest generation years later in Salem, as well as adults there who were to be triggered to react. The courts ultimately invented a cognitive distortion, or in this case, a label for knowledge coming from people's unconscious minds, spectral evidence, or in the end, that all such evidence was that of ghosts. Although the evidence, before that distortion was applied, was simply accepted without critical thinking, then used in an extreme to justify executions, then generalized months later after such evidence was deemed not relevant and so was not utilized in any way. Essentially, all facts were dismissed with false justification that no further understanding was needed. The UNTOP, almost 200 years later, formed a new appreciation for how completely the colonizing people were unconsciously manipulated by the indigenous people of the northeastern tribes in Salem. Specifically, an appreciation for the ineptitude of the colonizer's court to even notice that there might be another, exclusive mental state dominating behaviors, added to the fact that the colonizers as a whole were badly disabled by fear from recognition of the basic potentials of unconscious human communications. Accordingly, responsibly, the mass insanity in Santa Barbara was specifically directed at creating an understanding in the courts that could eventually be held by the population in general. Medical evaluation accompanied each insanity action, once held by the district court in Santa Barbara. The UNTOP realized that the fear in Salem had taken root in the population, then flourished and spread to people not influenced hypnotically, who became involved, expanding the accusations of witchcraft on their own to others completely innocent. Accordingly, observing this immense vulnerability to unconscious manipulation, the UNTOP put an emphasis on making a structured impact with an event covering the spectrum of potentials to create needed understanding of human behaviors in the colonizer's place of reason and truth. With some competent medical examination, because Salem did not have a great deal of detailed, objective records associated with the activities there, the UNTOP hoped a better understanding could be gained. The records of Salem were as if those scribing were caught up in the sensational, becoming too influenced to be objective. The UNTOP intent with the 1876 event was to at least establish a vestige of a focused study by court-ordered medical examinations of the potential extreme impacts of dynamic unconscious communications enabled through hypnosis, so that the people arriving and living on their land would have an appreciation of what the indigenous people of the land sought for their own descendants within purification of spiritual purposes inherent with exposing forbidden spiritual capacities. Salem was most effectively and uniformly understood as a delusion of witchcraft, which is the objective impression left without an understanding of the unconscious role described and evidenced with the series of related documentaries given in the beginning of this production. The explanation for Salem has been that it was a delusion, but that does not explain what was a mass delusion. In fact, Salem was an earlier, much less organized event of unconscious programming by indigenous spiritual people than was Santa Barbara in 1876, where native spiritual leaders were very disturbed about the taking of land and arbitrary killing of their people, as well as the propensity of colonization to ignore the unconscious existence, empowering the darker forces upon the indigenous people's territory. The UNTOP had a reasonable expectation that the insanity would be examined within the colonizers' federal courts in 1876, then at least documented and recorded properly. Optimistic UNTOP or their families hoped for criminal indictments of Indians, trying them for witchcraft to bring awareness. We may never know if they in any way succeeded, because the I section of the civil index of the district court was torn from the book. The pages of it shown, beginning with insanity, were later all that was recovered. Generally, cases involving Indians were all in the I section of a given civil index. The more realistic indigenous of the spiritual elite knew that the best that could be hoped for is that the records of the insanity action remained, empowering the people, who might discover the hidden truth of themselves for a more evolved society in the future. The insanity actions describing the effect of Indians were separated from the rest and not recorded. The index shows the changes of box numbers in the margins and the filtering process that placed acceptable records in the index as recorded. Later, the separated cases were burned before being transferred to microfilm, as were the rest of the court records in violation of state laws. The UNTOP hoped that eventually courts could exist in the land again that would counter and discourage the real threat of the human animalistic mind secretly controlling people with an aspect of the id that rejects reason in selfish and often cruel seizures of fear. Seizures often propagated by the dark European spiritual forces that might gain dominance over the vulnerable colonizing peoples of Turtle Island, something unthinkable to the Indigenous American spiritual leaders. It was their hope that their knowledge could be used to develop defenses, preventions, and cures against the dark abuses that they had always opposed. The northeastern woodlands tribes recalled the last Europeans being mystical Celtic people as the mound builders before the legends of the Long War and the Great Peace. By seeing the European people return as colonists with the beliefs and fears they had, the UNTOP learned what it meant to have undergone the Crusades. Their understanding of the unconscious mind and how fear itself works upon it brought them to vow their understanding would not be relinquished. For their commitment, they paid a price of what might be seen as permanent persecution until they became lost in the populations of the Spanish and Mexican people that they hid amongst to avoid the manhunts and survive in the only way that they might. The court case files generated by the mass insanity were destroyed in 1959 when the state of California reformed the counties of the state. Only the arrest and booking records remained, as is documented by this declaration first shared by CIRCA. But then, when the arrest and booking records were subpoenaed, the county failed to appear in court, and the public was left completely vulnerable to extreme, deadly behaviors, which began in 2000 with the kidnapping and murder of a 15-year-old boy in Sherman Oaks, California, who was brought to Santa Barbara. Nicholas Markowitz. Dark spiritual forces originating in Europe sought to shame the Indigenous Americans by using the unconscious minds of people in the natives' territory to commit horrible acts in desecration of their most sacred shrine. This kidnapping was an effort to collect on a drug deal made with Markowitz's brother. After being held in a local motel for a time, Markowitz was taken to a sacred place of the Chumash people, which has been featured continuously in this series, focusing on the spiritual knowledge of these ancient American people, the Grandmother's Shrine. Finally, on August 8, 2000, the indecision was over. Dark forces had used the unconscious minds of the group, working behind memory barriers normal with somnambulism, that had gathered around the leader, Hollywood, following their instructions under the conditions described to them that were upon them when they acted. In this case, to take Markowitz to a place approximately 5 feet to the north of the line of the winter solstice shrine seen here, to kill him and bury him. an extreme desecration of the most sacred of the Chumash shrines, dedicated to the power of knowledge, serving love, protecting life within